Jim would have been proud. That's the longest opening statement since former chairman Jim Oberstar, but you only did it in one language. So we could have we could add a simultaneous translation, perhaps. Thanks for the time, Mr. Chairman. First off, I spent about over an hour with Dr. Dillingham from the GAO, who I would say is the foremost expert and the longest-term critic of the FAA, its procurement process, and movement toward a 21st century system. And I'm not aware that any other member of the committee has spent that time with him, and he has not been invited to testify. He has a different story to tell today, and he thinks it will be a mistake, and I'm paraphrasing, but we are now on the cusp of a 21st century system that will be the envy of the world. And he and other experts, MITRE Corporation, others say a massive change now, where you cleave the FAA into parts. You leave the most vital thing to our manufacturers, certification, subject to appropriations, sequestrations, and shutdowns. You leave the most vital thing that is important to the American public, which is safety and oversight of safety, subject to sequestration, shutdowns, and political meddling. The only thing that gets moved is the ATO, and the ATO would be moved and essentially effectively controlled by the airlines. I know the airlines aren't here today, perhaps because they haven't looked so great recently in public. And I'd also note that the airlines themselves have had outages 36 times, major outages, 36 times since 2015. I'm not aware that the National Air Traffic Control System has had a major disruption, with the exception of deliberate sabotage by a contractor who knew how to get the system and the backup system. But the airlines, on their own, with no sabotage, have managed to melt down their dispatch and their reservation systems 36 times, stranding millions of people, so they can do it better, right? That's an interesting question. So I think that members of this committee who want to be educated on this should take, and maybe we can invite them in here, and spend that hour with Dr. Dillingham and hear the story of how things have changed and the progress we're making and the potential for disruption at this point in time. In terms of funding, the FAA is currently projected over the next decade to be 97% self-funded. Unfortunately, the way our colleagues around here in the budget process works, despite the fact they're self-funded, they can be sequestered or shut down. That's a simple fix. Take it off budget. Make it into a trust-funded program. They are raising the revenues. That's a simple fix. No, we're going to cleave it in half, put vital functions over here, still subject to sequestration shutdown, and take this one part and put it over here and say somehow they're going to self-fund. Now, the question, of course, is how are they going to self-fund? The airlines have told me time and time again they hate the ticket tax. They hate the ticket tax. They say that's our money. I say, no, it's not your money. I buy a ticket, I pay the tax goes to the government. It's not your money. They say, no, that affects the price of the ticket and competition and everything else. It's a horrible thing. So if they do away with the ticket tax, there goes 70% of the revenues. What are they going to put in its place? It's going to be a per operation charge or something. We don't know. Congress will have no say over this. Now, there will be a board, if I could have that slide, and a construct which is, we'll show here for the person running the slides. If you could put up, come on. Could put up this slide, please. And this is the new construct. Anything that affects competition will go through this process. The board makes a decision about a new approach, a new route, new fees. All that goes through this process and then goes to the secretary. The secretary will have established a large new office of consultants within his, or at this point, her office, who will advise the secretary of a limited period of time. And if the secretary and the board disagree, they go to court. Now, that's a great way to deal with new approaches, funding, and a whole bunch of other things. Congress will have nothing to say about what people or the American people are charged for running this system. When the ticket tax goes away, what happens to the AIP program? What happens to safety? What happens to certification? We had testimony from a gentleman in here who has an intriguing new model to serve small and mid-sized cities, and he said his biggest problem is certification, and he said the people are good at the FAA, there aren't enough of them doing certification. They don't have enough funding. Well, is this new enlightened board going to generously fund that also? We have assurances. Don't worry about those things. You can put that down now. Now, we've heard other things here that are, an interesting construct, which is we are way behind because we don't use ADSB. If I could have the first slide, please. Can we get a slide? Okay, this is the oceanic airspace. And you'll notice that the vast majority of the planes are in oceanic control by UK and Canada. So they're using ADSB. Makes sense. Now, we're not. Currently, airlines pay to have satellite-based navigation a fee in this lower part of the chart. There aren't that many because people do the loop to the north. So in fact, we have, NAV Canada has one aircraft in continental airspace for every aircraft in oceanic airspace. We have one aircraft in oceanic airspace for every 51 in the air over the United States of America. Now go to the second slide. Oh, by the way, go to the second slide. Now, see all that yellow? That's the US. That is going to be totally ADSB, satellite-based in 2020, with an exception. The airlines have petitioned and been given permission from the FAA for exceptions because many of their older planes do not have modern enough GPS systems to use the new ADSB. The airlines, again, have petitioned that they have a number more years before those planes would be able to use the ADSB system, not the FAA, the airlines themselves. Now, Canada is going to continue to have a radar-based system because they don't have much domestic traffic. And so we're being criticized because we won't pay a bunch of money for the few planes that use our oceanic airspace, but we are going to put, 100 times that many planes under ADSB in 2020. Now, here's my fear. My fear is there were disruptions in Canada. There were disruptions in Great Britain, including the bankruptcy of the system and a bailout. And, every system that has transit, and all the others in the world have gone to government-based corporations or government-controlled corporations. And there's only 2 countries that have gone the other way. And MITRE has done studies, others have done studies. There will be a period of disruption, particularly when you're cleaving the agency in half. And the certification people over here who have to certify the new approaches, who have to certify the new equipment, they're on furlough because the stupid Congress did another shutdown or sequestration. But the ATO is up and running. Well, you can't use those new approaches because the people over here who have to certify it can't work. Now, splitting this agency in half does not make sense to me. Now, the chairman talked about the failed reforms. I sat down with the FAA administrator, who also has not been invited to testify before this committee on this subject, who I think has made tremendous strides and brought the agency way under control compared to anyone else in recent history. And he said, well, they failed because Congress failed to say that the trolls at OMB and the secretary couldn't meddle. So the proposed reforms didn't go forward because OMB took control, as they do over too many things, and then the secretary messed with it, and they ended up with a system. I know, Mr. Poole, you find this amazing, but that's the way it happened. And these did not go forward. So simply, you could just say, we are going to give authority to reform procurement. We are going to give authority to reform personnel to the head of the FAA, whose proposals will not be subject to OMB because they're now self-funding and will not be subject to meddling by the Secretary of Transportation and her staff. That would be a significant way to get there. Put it off budget. It's already raising the revenue it needs, but no, we're going to have a new corporation that's going to figure out a different way to raise revenue. By the way, forget about safety, forget about certification. They're afterthoughts over there in the government, not funded by any stable source. I've invited a witness today, and I hope people listen carefully, Joe Brown. He's the president of Heart Cell Propeller. His family has been involved in the aviation business since the Wright brothers, actually. It's an interesting story, but he won't have a chance to tell that today because I want him to focus on his experience both in that industry and as a pilot, and to talk about what he sees as the things that are at risk as a pilot, a GA pilot in this country, and things that we have done that are extraordinary for GA pilots that would be at risk in a new system, because why would the commercial airlines give a darn about all those GA airports and all those new improved approaches and updating those? Because that costs money. And that's not in their interest. They don't use them. They don't care. So we'll hear from him, and I think his testimony is going to be a little more compelling than a couple of think tank people that we're going to hear from yet again and again and again. But we haven't heard from the FAA administrator, we haven't heard from Dr. Dillingham, but Ms. Robine is here for the second or third time, and Mr. Poole for the umpteenth time from his wonderful right-wing think tank. So that's what we have before us, Mr. Chairman. I do think there are things we could agree upon, but you know, I do not believe that privatizing the ATO is the answer. Thank you.
Well, I thank the gentleman. You almost